When you think of Coca-Cola, you think of a global empire, a bottle recognized in every corner of the world, a brand worth over $80 billion, a product sold in more than 200 countries. But here's what most people don't know. The family that created Coca-Cola never became the wealthiest family from it. In fact, the original creator died broke, and his heirs sold the company for what would become one of the most regretted business decisions in American history. This is not a story about business strategy or marketing genius. This is a story about inheritance, about what happens when a formula worth billions passes through the hands of people who don't recognize its value. It's about timing, desperation, and the crushing weight of missed opportunity that haunted generations. The Coca-Cola fortune is unusual because it fractured early, split between those who held on and those who let go. Unlike the Rockefellers or the Vanderbilts, whose wealth stayed concentrated within family lines for decades, the Pemberton family, the original creators, walked away with almost nothing. Meanwhile, another family, the Woodruffs, seized control and turned Coca-Cola into the most recognized brand on the planet. To understand how this happened, you need to go back to 1886, to a small pharmacy in Atlanta, Georgia, where a morphine-addicted pharmacist named John Stith Pemberton was trying to create a cure for headaches. He had no idea he was about to invent the most valuable beverage formula in human history. But he also had no idea that within 2 years he would be dead, and his family would lose everything. Pemberton wasn't a businessman. He was an inventor, a tinkerer, someone who believed that the next great remedy was always one experiment away. He had spent years creating various tonics and medicines, most of which failed commercially. By 1886, he was in poor health, addicted to morphine after being wounded in the Civil War, and desperate for a breakthrough that could secure his family's financial future. On May 8, 1886, he mixed together a syrup made from coca leaves, cola nuts, sugar, and other ingredients. He brought it to Jacob's Pharmacy in Atlanta, where it was mixed with carbonated water and sold for 5 cents a glass. It was marketed as a brain tonic and cure for headaches, nervousness, and exhaustion. The drink was named Coca-Cola by Pemberton's bookkeeper, Frank Robinson, who also designed the now iconic script logo. In that first year, Pemberton sold about 9 glasses a day. He spent $50 on advertising and made $50 in revenue. It was not a success. It was barely breaking even. But Pemberton believed in it. He believed this formula could change everything. What he didn't know was that he wouldn't live long enough to see it happen. By 1887, Pemberton's health was deteriorating rapidly. He was battling stomach cancer, struggling with his morphine addiction, and drowning in debt. He needed money immediately, not in 5 years, not when the business grew, right now. And so he began selling off pieces of his company. First, he sold a 2/3 stake to 2 businessmen, Willis Venable and George Lowndes. Then, as his condition worsened, he sold even more shares to another businessman, Asa Candler, a fellow pharmacist who saw potential in the drink. On August 16, 1888, just 2 years after creating Coca-Cola, John Pemberton died. He was 57 years old. At the time of his death, he owned virtually none of the company he had created. His estate was worth almost nothing. His son, Charles Pemberton, inherited no fortune, no business empire, no stake in what would become the world's most valuable beverage brand. Instead, he inherited debt and the fading memory of his father's invention. Charles tried to continue his father's work. He attempted to create his own version of Coca-Cola, but he lacked the business acumen and resources to compete. He struggled with his own addiction issues and eventually faded into obscurity. He died in 1894 at the age of 40, penniless and forgotten. The Pemberton family's connection to Coca-Cola effectively ended there. Meanwhile, Asa Candler had been quietly buying up every remaining share of Coca-Cola he could find. By 1891, he had acquired complete control of the company for a total investment of about $300. In today's money, that's roughly $75. He had just purchased a company that would eventually be worth hundreds of billions. Candler was everything Pemberton wasn't. He was a shrewd businessman, a relentless marketer, and someone who understood the power of brand recognition. Under his leadership, Coca-Cola exploded. He invested heavily in advertising, distributing branded clocks, calendars, and promotional materials to pharmacies across the country. By 1895, Coca-Cola was being sold in every U.S. state. By 1900, it was a national phenomenon. But even Candler didn't fully grasp the potential of what he had. In 1919, facing pressure from his family and wanting to focus on other ventures, he sold the Coca-Cola Company to a group of investors led by Ernest Woodruff for $25 million. At the time, it was the largest financial transaction in the history of the South. Candler thought he had made a brilliant deal. He had turned a $300 investment into $25 million. He died wealthy, surrounded by family, his legacy secure. But the real story was only just beginning, because the Woodruff family, specifically Ernest Woodruff's son Robert, was about to take Coca-Cola to heights no one had imagined, and in doing so, they would create a fortune so vast, so deeply embedded in American and global culture, that the Pemberton family's loss would become one of the most staggering examples of missed inheritance in history. This is the story of how one family lost everything, and another built an empire on what was left behind. To understand the inheritance dynamics of the Coca-Cola fortune, you have to understand the transition of power from Asa Candler to the Woodruff family, and then from Ernest Woodruff to his son Robert. This is where the story shifts from a pharmaceutical curiosity to a global empire, and where the real wealth, the kind that echoes through generations, was forged. When Asa Candler sold Coca-Cola in 1919, he did so reluctantly. He was getting older, his children were pressuring him to step away from the business, and prohibition was looming on the horizon. Many people believed that prohibition would devastate the beverage industry, since Coca-Cola was often mixed with alcohol in bars. Candler saw the sale as a way to cash out at the peak, to secure his family's wealth before uncertain times arrived. The buyer was a syndicate led by Ernest Woodruff, an Atlanta banker and businessman with deep connections in finance. Woodruff didn't buy Coca-Cola because he loved the product. He bought it because he saw it as an undervalued asset with massive growth potential. The $25 million price tag was financed largely through loans, making it a leveraged buyout decades before that term became common on Wall Street. Ernest Woodruff was a calculating man. He restructured the company, took it public in 1919, and immediately began professionalizing its operations. He installed experienced managers, expanded bottling operations, and pushed Coca-Cola into new markets. But Ernest himself was not the visionary. That role would fall to his son, Robert Winship Woodruff, who would transform Coca-Cola from a successful American company into a global cultural phenomenon. Robert Woodruff became president of Coca-Cola in 1923 at the age of 33. His relationship with his father was complicated. Ernest was a stern, demanding man who believed in discipline and hard work. He had high expectations for Robert, and Robert spent much of his early life trying to meet them. When Robert took over Coca-Cola, it wasn't just a business opportunity, it was a chance to prove himself, to step out of his father's shadow and build something that would outlast them both. And that's exactly what he did. Over the next 6 decades, Robert Woodruff turned Coca-Cola into one of the most recognized brands on earth. He introduced the 6-bottle carton, making it easier for families to buy Coca-Cola in bulk. He pushed the company into vending machines and coolers, ensuring that Coca-Cola was always within arm's reach. He developed international markets aggressively, particularly during World War II, when he made it his mission to supply every American soldier with a Coca-Cola, no matter where they were stationed. This decision during the war was a masterstroke. The U.S. military set up Coca-Cola bottling plants near battlefronts in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. Soldiers associated Coca-Cola with home, with comfort, with America itself. When the war ended, those soldiers came back and continued drinking Coca-Cola. Meanwhile, the infrastructure built during the war allowed Coca-Cola to expand rapidly into foreign markets. By the 1950s, Coca-Cola was a global brand, synonymous with American culture. Robert Woodruff never married and had no children. His life was Coca-Cola. He lived modestly despite his immense wealth, avoiding publicity and preferring to work behind the scenes. He was known for his philanthropy, donating millions to hospitals, universities, and cultural institutions in Atlanta, most notably Emory University, which received over $100 million from Woodruff during his lifetime. But here's where the inheritance story becomes fascinating. Robert Woodruff accumulated one of the largest personal fortunes in America, estimated at well over $1 billion by the time of his death in 1985. Yet, because he had no children, that fortune didn't pass to a direct bloodline. Instead, it was distributed according to his will, which directed the bulk of his wealth into charitable foundations, particularly the Woodruff Foundation, which continues to operate today with assets exceeding several $billions. The Woodruff family did inherit significant wealth, but it was spread across multiple branches, cousins, nieces, nephews, rather than concentrated in a single heir. This diffusion of wealth meant that while the Woodruff name remained associated with Coca-Cola and Atlanta's elite society, no single Woodruff heir became a dominant figure in the way Robert had been. Meanwhile, Asa Candler's descendants did inherit substantial wealth from his estate, but they faced a different challenge. They had sold the company. When Candler died in 1929, his estate was valued at around $50 million, a fortune by any measure. His children inherited this wealth and lived comfortably, investing in real estate, banking, and other ventures. But they watched from the sidelines as Coca-Cola's value skyrocketed under Robert Woodruff's leadership. By the 1950s, Coca-Cola was worth billions. By the 1980s, tens of billions. Today, the brand alone is valued at over $80 billion, and the Coca-Cola Company has a market capitalization exceeding $250 billion. If Asa Candler's family had held on to even a fraction of their original stake, they would be among the wealthiest families in the world. Instead, they made a comfortable but ultimately modest fortune compared to what could have been. And the Pembertons? They got nothing. John Pemberton's grandchildren and great-grandchildren lived ordinary lives, completely disconnected from the empire their ancestor had created. There are Pemberton descendants alive today who have no financial connection to Coca-Cola whatsoever. They carry the name, but not the fortune. This creates a stark contrast. 3 families, 3 completely different outcomes. The Pembertons, who invented the formula, ended up with nothing. The Candlers, who built the initial business, made millions but missed out on billions. The Woodruffs, who bought the company and expanded it globally, became one of the wealthiest and most influential families in American history. But wealth alone doesn't tell the whole story. The inheritance battles, the family dynamics, the decisions made under pressure, these are what reveal the human dimension of fortune. And in the case of Coca-Cola, those dynamics were shaped by timing, vision, and the willingness to hold on when others let go. In the next part, we'll explore the deeper forces at play, the curiosity that drives people to build empires, the mistakes that cause them to lose everything, and the moments of decision that separate legendary fortunes from forgotten names. What drives someone to sell a company that will one day be worth billions? What makes one generation hold on while another lets go? These aren't just financial questions. They're psychological ones, rooted in how people perceive risk, value, and legacy. When Asa Candler sold Coca-Cola in 1919, he wasn't making a mistake by the standards of his time. He was 67 years old, had built a massively successful company, and was cashing out for an amount that made him one of the wealthiest men in the South. $25 million in 1919 is equivalent to roughly $400 million today. By any reasonable measure, he had won. But here's the question that haunted his descendants. Why didn't he see what was coming? Why didn't he recognize that Coca-Cola wasn't just a beverage company, but a cultural force that would only grow more valuable as global markets expanded? The answer lies in the limits of vision and the pressures of the moment. Candler was facing several immediate concerns. Prohibition was coming, and many business people believed it would devastate the beverage industry. His children were urging him to step back, to enjoy his wealth while he still could. He had other interests, real estate, civic projects, philanthropy, that he wanted to pursue. And perhaps most importantly, he had already made a fortune beyond his wildest dreams. To him, holding on for the possibility of even more seemed unnecessary, even greedy. This is a common pattern in inheritance stories. The founder builds the business, makes a fortune, and then exits, believing they've secured their family's future. The next generation inherits wealth, but not the business itself. They live comfortably, but they watch as the enterprise they could have owned grows exponentially in someone else's hands. The Candler children were not poor. They inherited millions. They lived in grand homes, traveled extensively, and invested in various ventures. But they also had to reckon with the knowledge that if their father had held on just a little longer, or if he had structured the sale differently, perhaps retaining a stake, or passing ownership to the next generation rather than selling outright, they could have inherited one of the great American fortunes. There's a particular kind of regret that comes with that realization. It's not the regret of failure, but the regret of missed potential. It's the knowledge that everything was right there within reach, and then it slipped away, not because of bad luck or poor decisions, but because of timing and perspective. Now consider the Woodruff family's approach. Ernest Woodruff bought Coca-Cola not as a long-term legacy play, but as a financial investment. He was a banker, used to buying and selling assets for profit. But his son Robert saw something different. Robert saw Coca-Cola not as a product, but as an idea, a symbol of refreshment, happiness, and American optimism that could be exported to the entire world. This difference in vision is critical. Ernest thought in terms of returns and market position. Robert thought in terms of cultural penetration and brand immortality. Ernest would have been willing to sell if the right offer came along. Robert never even considered it. To him, selling Coca-Cola would have been like selling a piece of American identity. This philosophical difference shaped the inheritance dynamics within the Woodruff family. Robert spent his entire adult life building Coca-Cola, and he did so with an almost religious devotion. He reinvested profits into expansion, marketing, and innovation. He resisted short-term pressures to maximize dividends, focusing instead on long-term brand strength. He understood that the real value wasn't in quarterly earnings, but in the permanence of the Coca-Cola name. Because Robert had no children, he couldn't pass the business to a direct heir. But he could ensure that his life's work would continue. He did this by building a management culture at Coca-Cola that prioritized brand integrity above all else. He surrounded himself with executives who shared his vision, and he made sure that even after his death, Coca-Cola would remain focused on global expansion and brand protection. His wealth, meanwhile, was directed into philanthropy. The Woodruff Foundation became one of the most influential charitable organizations in the South, funding hospitals, universities, and cultural institutions. In a sense, Robert Woodruff's inheritance wasn't financial. It was institutional. He didn't leave behind heirs who would live off his fortune. He left behind institutions that would carry his values forward. This raises an interesting question. Is that a better legacy than passing wealth to children? The Candler descendants inherited millions and lived well, but they also lived in the shadow of a decision they didn't make. The Woodruff descendants inherited less directly, but they were connected to a name that represented vision and impact. The Pembertons inherited nothing at all, but their ancestor's name is still attached to one of the most famous products in history. There's no clear answer, but the question reveals something important about inheritance. It's not just about money. It's about identity, meaning, and the stories families tell themselves about where they came from and what they're meant to do. And then there are the what-ifs. What if John Pemberton had lived another 10 years? What if he had found a partner who understood business as well as he understood chemistry? What if Charles Pemberton had been able to hold on to even a small stake in the company? The Pemberton family would be worth billions today. They would be in the same conversation as the Waltons, the Kochs, the Mars family, But history doesn't work that way. Fortunes aren't built on what-ifs. They're built on decisions, timing, and the ability to see value where others see risk. The Coca-Cola inheritance story is ultimately a story about those who saw the future and those who didn't, and the generational consequences of that difference in vision. In the next part, we'll go deeper into the mechanisms of how these fortunes were transferred, the legal and financial structures that preserved or squandered wealth, and the moments of crisis when everything could have gone differently. The transfer of wealth across generations isn't automatic. It requires structure, foresight, and often legal maneuvering that can make or break a family's fortune. In the case of Coca-Cola, the inheritance outcomes were shaped not just by vision, but by the specific mechanisms through which ownership and wealth were transferred. Let's start with the Pemberton family. When John Pemberton died in 1888, he left behind virtually no estate. The business he had created was already in the hands of others. There was no trust, no retained ownership stake, no financial instrument that would allow his heirs to benefit from Coca-Cola's future success. His son Charles inherited nothing of value, and when Charles died 6 years later, the Pemberton connection to Coca-Cola was severed completely. This is the most extreme form of inheritance failure, the complete loss of ownership before the asset appreciates. It's not uncommon in the early stages of a startup or invention. Founders who are desperate for cash or who don't fully understand the value of what they've created often sell too early. In Pemberton's case, his poor health and financial desperation forced his hand. He didn't have the luxury of waiting to see if Coca-Cola would succeed. Now consider Asa Candler. When he sold Coca-Cola in 1919, he structured the sale as an outright transaction. He received $25 million in cash and securities, and in return, he gave up all ownership in the company. He then distributed this wealth among his children through his estate. When he died in 1929, his will divided his fortune, real estate, investments, cash, among his heirs. This is a more common inheritance structure. The founder cashes out, converts the business into liquid wealth, and passes that wealth to the next generation. The advantage is that the heirs receive immediate, tangible assets. The disadvantage is that they lose any claim to the business's future growth. The Candler heirs received millions, but they also received a static fortune. As Coca-Cola's value exploded over the next decades, they had no mechanism to participate in that growth. They could invest their inheritance, of course, and many did, but they were no longer tied to the engine of wealth creation that Coca-Cola represented. This is where the difference between wealth and ownership becomes critical. Wealth can be spent, invested, or lost. Ownership, especially ownership of a growing enterprise, compounds over time. The Candler family had wealth. The Woodruff family had ownership. Robert Woodruff's approach to inheritance was different because his situation was different. He had no children, so the traditional model of passing ownership to the next generation didn't apply. Instead, he focused on institutional continuity. He wanted Coca-Cola to outlast him, and he wanted his wealth to have a lasting impact. To achieve this, he placed the bulk of his fortune into charitable trusts and foundations. The Woodruff Foundation, established during his lifetime and expanded after his death, became one of the largest philanthropic organizations in the American South. It funds medical research, education, and cultural projects, and it does so with an endowment built on Coca-Cola stock and other investments. This structure has a unique inheritance characteristic. The wealth doesn't belong to individuals, but it remains associated with the family name. The Woodruff family doesn't own the foundation's assets, but they benefit from the prestige, influence, and social capital that come from being connected to such a significant institution. There's also the matter of Coca-Cola stock itself. When Ernest Woodruff bought the company in 1919, he structured it as a publicly traded corporation. This meant that ownership was divided into shares which could be bought, sold, and inherited. Members of the Woodruff family, as well as other early investors, held significant stock positions. Over time, as Coca-Cola grew, those stock positions became extraordinarily valuable. A single share purchased in 1919 for $40, with dividends reinvested, would be worth over $10 million today. Families that held onto their stock became wealthy beyond measure. Families that sold early made a profit, but nothing compared to what they could have had. This is the power of compounding equity. It's not just about the initial investment. It's about holding on through decades of growth, resisting the temptation to cash out during downturns or moments of doubt. The families that understood this, that built their inheritance strategies around long-term equity ownership, are the ones that built generational wealth. The Woodruff family understood this. Even as Robert directed much of his wealth into philanthropy, other branches of the family maintained their stock positions. They benefited not just from Robert's direct inheritance, but from the rising value of the shares they held. This created a dual inheritance: institutional legacy through the foundation and personal wealth through equity. But not every branch of the family held on. Some Woodruff relatives sold their shares over the years, either due to financial need, diversification strategies, or simple impatience. Those who sold early made money, sometimes significant amounts, but they also cut themselves off from future growth. This pattern repeats across inheritance stories in every major fortune. The descendants who hold on, who resist the urge to liquidate, who build their financial lives around preserving rather than spending the family asset, these are the ones who remain wealthy generations later. The ones who cash out, who view inheritance as a windfall to be spent or invested elsewhere, often see their wealth dilute over time. There's also the question of expertise and involvement. Robert Woodruff didn't just own Coca-Cola, he ran it. He devoted his life to it. He understood every aspect of the business, from bottling logistics to international marketing. This deep involvement meant he knew when to hold and when to expand. He wasn't a passive investor. He was the architect of the empire. His relatives, by contrast, were often passive beneficiaries. They owned stock. They received dividends, but they weren't in the boardroom making decisions. This distance from the business meant they didn't have the same emotional or strategic attachment to it. For them, Coca-Cola stock was an asset, not an identity. This dynamic, active founder versus passive heirs, is one of the central tensions in inheritance. The founder builds the wealth through vision and effort. The heirs receive it as a gift without the same connection or understanding. And over time, that gap in understanding can lead to divergent outcomes. Some heirs recognize the value and preserve it, while others see it as a resource to be used and eventually exhausted. In the next part, we'll examine the key turning points, the moments when these inheritance paths were set in motion, the decisions that locked in fortunes or lost them forever. Every great fortune has its pivotal moments, decisions made under pressure, opportunities seized or missed, moments when the entire trajectory of a family's wealth shifts. For the families connected to Coca-Cola, these turning points reveal not just the mechanics of inheritance, but the human factors that determine who keeps wealth and who loses it. The first major turning point came in 1888 when John Pemberton, sick and desperate, sold off his remaining stake in Coca-Cola. He had two choices: hold on and hope the business would eventually provide for his family, or sell immediately and relieve his financial distress. He chose the latter. It's easy to judge that decision with hindsight, but at the time, it made sense. Pemberton was dying. He had debts. The business was struggling. Selling was rational. But here's the tragedy. If Pemberton had found a way to hold on for just a few more years, if he had secured a loan, found a partner, or convinced his family to wait, everything would have changed. By the mid-1890s, under Asa Candler's management, Coca-Cola was becoming profitable and expanding rapidly. Even a small retained stake would have made the Pemberton family wealthy. This illustrates a harsh truth about inheritance. Timing matters more than almost anything else. The difference between a fortune and nothing can come down to a few years, a single decision, one moment of desperation. The second turning point came in 1919, when Asa Candler sold the company to Ernest Woodruff. Candler was at the peak of his success. Coca-Cola was a national brand, profitable and growing. He had every reason to believe he was making a smart decision by cashing out at $25 million. But he made a critical error in structure. He sold the entire company. He didn't retain a stake. He didn't set up a family trust that would hold shares for future generations. He converted ownership into cash and then distributed that cash through his estate. If Candler had structured the sale differently, if he had sold a controlling interest but retained, say, 20% of the company for his family, the Candler descendants would be billionaires today. That 20% stake would be worth over $50 billion at current valuations. This is the second harsh truth. Structure determines legacy. It's not enough to build wealth. You have to preserve it through the right legal and financial mechanisms. Selling outright gives you immediate liquidity, but it cuts off future growth. Retaining equity, even partial equity, keeps you connected to the upside. The third turning point came in 1923, when Robert Woodruff took over as president of Coca-Cola. This was a generational handoff from father to son, but it was more than that. It was a transition from a financial investor to a true believer. Ernest Woodruff saw Coca-Cola as a good investment. Robert saw it as a mission. That difference in perspective shaped everything that came after. Robert didn't just manage the company, he transformed it. He took it global. He embedded it in American culture. He made it untouchable, and critically, he never sold. There were moments when selling would have been tempting. During the Great Depression, when stock prices collapsed. During World War II, when the future was uncertain. During the 1970s, when the company faced increased competition from Pepsi. But Robert held on, and by doing so, he ensured that the Woodruff name would be associated with one of the greatest business successes in history. This is the third truth. Conviction creates legacy. The families that hold on through uncertainty, that resist the urge to cash out during turbulent times, are the ones that build generational wealth. There were also smaller turning points, moments that might seem minor, but had significant consequences. For example, in the 1930s, some Woodruff family members sold their Coca-Cola stock to cover expenses during the Depression. Others held on, tightened their belts, and waited. The ones who sold made it through the Depression, but they lost the compounding growth that came in the decades after. The ones who held on became extraordinarily wealthy. Similarly, some Candler descendants invested their inheritance wisely, growing their wealth through real estate and other ventures. Others spent lavishly, assuming the money would last forever. Within 2 generations, some branches of the Candler family were still wealthy, while others had burned through their inheritance entirely. This reveals another truth: inheritance is not a one-time event. It's a process that unfolds over generations, and each generation makes choices that either preserve or dissipate the wealth. The families that treat inheritance as a responsibility, that build systems to protect and grow the assets, are the ones that stay wealthy. The families that treat it as a windfall, that spend without discipline, see their fortunes disappear. One of the most fascinating turning points involves Robert Woodruff's decision to direct his wealth into philanthropy. When he died in 1985, he was worth well over $1 billion. He could have left that fortune to distant relatives, creating a new generation of Woodruff heirs living off his success. Instead, he chose to give the majority of it away. This decision was controversial within the family. Some relatives felt they deserved more, that they were entitled to a share of the fortune Robert had built. But Robert saw it differently. He believed that great wealth came with great responsibility, and that the best use of his fortune was to improve society, not to fund the lifestyles of people who hadn't earned it. This raises a profound question. What is the purpose of inheritance? Is it to provide for your descendants, ensuring they live comfortably even if they contribute nothing? Or is it to create a legacy, to use your wealth to make a lasting impact on the world? Robert Woodruff chose legacy over lineage. The result is that the Woodruff name is still revered in Atlanta and beyond, associated with hospitals, universities, and cultural institutions that serve millions of people. His relatives may not have inherited billions, but they inherited something arguably more valuable, a name that means something, a reputation built on generosity and vision. The Candler descendants, by contrast, inherited wealth, but not a defining mission. They lived well, but they didn't build institutions that carried the family name forward. And the Pembertons? They inherited nothing, not wealth, not legacy, not even recognition. These turning points, Pemberton's desperate sale, Candler's decision to cash out, Robert Woodruff's refusal to sell, his choice to give his fortune away, are the moments that define the inheritance outcomes for each family. They show that wealth is not just about money. It's about decisions, values, and the vision to see beyond the immediate moment. In the final part, we'll bring all of this together. The resolution of these inheritance stories, the lessons they teach, and what they reveal about the nature of wealth and legacy. So, where does all of this leave us? Three families, three radically different outcomes, all connected to the same product. The Pembertons, who invented Coca-Cola, received nothing. The Candlers, who built it into a national brand, made millions but missed billions. The Woodruffs, who transformed it into a global empire, accumulated vast wealth and created a lasting legacy. What determined these outcomes wasn't luck, and it wasn't just business acumen. It was a combination of timing, vision, and the structures they put in place, or failed to put in place, to preserve wealth across generations. The Pemberton story is a tragedy of desperation and missed opportunity. John Pemberton created something extraordinary, but he did so at the worst possible time in his life. Sick, addicted, and broke. He had no choice but to sell. His son inherited nothing because there was nothing to inherit. The lesson here is brutal but clear. Creation alone doesn't guarantee wealth. You have to survive long enough to see the value realized, or you have to build structures that allow your heirs to benefit even if you don't. The Candler story is more complex. Asa Candler did everything right by the standards of his era. He recognized the value of Coca-Cola when others didn't. He bought it for almost nothing, built it into a powerhouse, and sold it for a fortune. He provided generously for his children who lived comfortable, prosperous lives. But he also made a critical error. He sold the entire company. He converted ownership into cash, and in doing so, he cut his family off from the future growth of Coca-Cola. His descendants watched as the company they could have owned became one of the most valuable in the world, and they had no claim to it. This is the central tension in many inheritance stories. Do you cash out and secure immediate wealth for your children, or do you hold on and give them the chance at exponential growth? There's no perfect answer, but history tends to favor those who hold on. The Woodruff story is different because Robert Woodruff had no direct heirs. He couldn't pass ownership to children, so he focused instead on legacy. He ran Coca-Cola for 6 decades, expanding it into every corner of the globe. He made it more than a product. He made it a symbol. And when it came time to pass on his wealth, he chose to give the majority of it away. The Woodruff Foundation, funded with his fortune, continues to operate today with billions of dollars in assets. It funds medical research, education, and cultural projects. It carries the Woodruff name forward not through descendants, but through impact. Some might see this as a failure of inheritance. After all, the Woodruff family didn't retain the full fortune. But others would argue it's the highest form of legacy, using wealth to create something that outlasts any individual, any family, any single generation. There's also the question of what happened to the broader Woodruff family, the cousins, nieces, nephews, and more distant relatives. Many of them did inherit wealth, either directly from Robert or from other family members who held Coca-Cola stock. Some managed that wealth wisely, maintaining their positions in Atlanta's elite society. Others were less disciplined, and their shares of the fortune diminished over time. Today, there are still Woodruffs in Atlanta who live well, who sit on boards of cultural institutions, who carry the family name with pride. But there's no single Woodruff heir who controls a vast fortune the way Robert once did. The wealth has diffused, spread across generations and charitable foundations. And what about Coca-Cola itself? The company continues to thrive, though it faces challenges that didn't exist in Robert Woodruff's era. Health concerns about sugar, competition from new beverage categories, changing consumer preferences, but the brand remains one of the most valuable in the world, and the company's market capitalization exceeds $250 billion. If the Pemberton family had retained even 1% of the company, it would be worth over $3 billion today. If the Candler family had kept 10%, it would be worth $25 billion. These numbers aren't just hypothetical. They represent real wealth that real families lost because of decisions made under pressure, without the benefit of hindsight. But here's the deeper truth. Inheritance isn't just about what you receive. It's about what you do with it. Some of the Candler descendants invested wisely and built their own fortunes. Some Woodruff relatives squandered their inheritance within a generation, and some families with no connection to Coca-Cola at all built extraordinary wealth through vision, discipline, and smart decision-making. The Coca-Cola inheritance story teaches us several lessons. First, creation and ownership are not the same thing. John Pemberton created Coca-Cola, but he never owned enough of it to benefit his family. Second, timing and structure determine legacy more than initial success. Asa Candler built a fortune, but his decision to sell outright limited his family's future wealth. Third, holding on through uncertainty is what separates generational wealth from one-time windfalls. And finally, there's the question of purpose. What is wealth for? Is it to provide comfort and security for your descendants? Is it to build institutions that carry your name and values forward? Is it to make an impact on the world that outlasts your own life? Robert Woodruff chose impact. Asa Candler chose security. John Pemberton never got to choose at all. Each path led to a different outcome, and each reflects different values about what inheritance should mean. Today, if you walk through Atlanta, you'll see the Woodruff name on the hospitals, art centers, and university buildings. You'll see Coca-Cola sold on every corner, in every convenience store and vending machines and restaurants worldwide. But you won't see a Pemberton Memorial or a Candler dynasty. The families that created and built Coca-Cola are largely forgotten by the public, while the brand they left behind has become immortal. That's the paradox of inheritance in the modern age. The products and companies can outlive the families that created them, becoming entities unto themselves, disconnected from any single bloodline. And yet, the stories remain. The decisions these families made to sell or hold, to spend or save, to prioritize immediate needs or long-term legacy, continue to echo through their descendants' lives. Some live with the knowledge that they could have been billionaires if only an ancestor had held on a few more years. Others live with the pride of a name associated with philanthropy and vision.